The sound of pins crashing, mixed with children's laughter, should have been the soundtrack to a perfect family evening. Instead, what I witnessed that Tuesday night at Pinewood Lanes turned into something that still gives me chills when I think about it. The way that teenage employee looked at the woman in lane 12, the sneer on his face as he pointed at her feet, the words that came out of his mouth next, they cut through that family-friendly atmosphere like a blade through silk. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Nice shoes, lady. Did you fish those out of a donation bin? I was at Pinewood Lanes that Tuesday evening for my nephew's birthday party, watching him attempt to knock down pins with a ball that probably weighed half as much as he did. The place was packed with families, the kind of wholesome chaos that makes you remember why these community spaces matter. Kids running between lanes, parents cheering for gutter balls like they were strikes, the smell of nachos and pizza drifting from the snack bar. It was pure Americana, the kind of scene that makes you feel good about the world. That's when I first noticed her. Lane 12, all the way at the end, away from the main family section. She was by herself, which seemed odd for family night, but not unusual enough to really register at first. What caught my attention was how methodically she approached her game. While kids were throwing balls with wild abandon and parents were focused more on taking photos than actually bowling, this woman treated each frame like it mattered. She looked to be in her 50s, maybe early 60s, with graying hair pulled back in a practical ponytail and the kind of posture that spoke of years of discipline. Her clothes were simple but clean, dark jeans and a navy blue pullover that had seen better days but was obviously well cared for. Nothing flashy, nothing that screamed for attention, just a woman who wanted to bowl a few frames in peace. What really struck me was her shoes. While everyone else was sporting the standard red, blue, and tan rental shoes that bowling alleys have been using since the dawn of time, hers were different. They were clearly rentals too, but they were the worn-down, obviously older pairs that most places keep in the back for when they run out of the better options, the kind that usually apologize for having to give you. Scuffed leather, mismatched laces, and that particular shade of faded brown that only comes from years of use by hundreds of different feet. She didn't seem bothered by them. In fact, she laced them up with the same careful attention she gave everything else, double knotting them like she was preparing for something more serious than a casual evening of bowling. When she stood up and approached the line, her form was textbook perfect. Smooth approach, consistent release, follow-through that belonged in an instructional video. Strike after strike after strike. The family in lane 11, a young couple with 2 elementary-aged kids, started taking notice. I watched the father nudge his wife and point discreetly toward lane 12. Pretty soon their kids were watching too, mesmerized by this quiet woman who was making the game look effortless while they struggled to keep their balls out of the gutters. That's when Tyler showed up. Tyler Brennan, according to his name tag, couldn't have been more than 19, with the kind of swagger that comes from being given the tiniest bit of authority and letting it go straight to your head. He was the evening shift supervisor, which at Pinewood Lanes meant he was responsible for keeping the rental shoes organized, handling lane assignments, and dealing with any customer issues that came up during the busy family night rush. I'd seen Tyler around before during previous visits with my nephew. He was the type who treated bowling alley customers like they were an inconvenience rather than the reason he had a job. Always seemed annoyed when parents needed help with the bumpers, always acted like explaining the scoring system to confused kids was beneath his dignity. But he saved his worst attitude for anyone he perceived as not fitting in with the typical family night crowd. When Tyler walked over to lane 12, I could tell something was brewing. He had that look in his eyes, the same look I'd seen bullies get right before they decided to make someone's day miserable. The woman, I later learned her name was Commander Lisa Hayes, was in the middle of her approach when Tyler decided to make his presence known. "Excuse me," he called out, loud enough that several nearby lanes turned to look. Commander Hayes stopped mid-approach, ball still in hand, and turned to face him with the kind of patience that suggested she dealt with difficult people before. "Is there a problem?" she asked quietly. Tyler looked her up and down with obvious disdain, his eyes stopping pointedly at her feet. "Yeah, there might be. Those shoes you're wearing? They're from our vintage collection. We usually don't give those out unless we're completely desperate." The way he said vintage collection made it clear he was being sarcastic. What he really meant was that she was wearing the rejects, the shoes they were embarrassed to rent out to paying customers. The implication hung in the air like smoke from a grease fire. Commander Hayes looked down at her shoes, then back up at Tyler with an expression that didn't change. They were what I was given when I paid for my rental. Are they not suitable for bowling? Oh, they'll work, Tyler said with a smirk that made my stomach turn. But let's be honest here. Family night brings in a certain caliber of customer. And those shoes, well, they kind of send the wrong message about the kind of establishment we're trying to run here. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. A teenager working at a bowling alley was actually suggesting that a paying customer's rental shoes weren't good enough for his establishment. The arrogance was breathtaking. Commander Hayes nodded slowly, processing what Tyler was saying without getting defensive or angry. I see. And what would you suggest I do about that? Tyler's confidence grew as he interpreted her calm response as weakness. Well, I could upgrade you to a better pair, but there would be an additional fee. Call it a premium shoe rental. Or, he paused for dramatic effect, you could always try the bowling alley across town. I hear they're less particular about their image. The insult was clear to everyone within earshot. Tyler wasn't just complaining about her shoes, he was suggesting she didn't belong there at all, that she was somehow lowering the tone of the place just by existing in his space. What happened next still amazes me when I think about it. Instead of getting angry, instead of demanding to speak to a manager, instead of making a scene, Commander Hayes simply nodded again and said, "I understand your position. What do I owe for the game I've already started?" Tyler seemed surprised by her compliance. He'd obviously been expecting an argument, maybe even hoping for one so he could play the victim and have her escorted out. Instead, he found himself looking at a woman who was offering to leave quietly rather than cause any trouble. "The games are prepaid," he said, some of the wind going out of his sails. "But maybe next time you could, dress a little more appropriately for family night." That last comment was what did it. It wasn't enough for Tyler to humiliate her about the shoes. He had to take a shot at her entire appearance, her right to be there, her worth as a customer and as a person. Commander Hayes stood there for a moment, and I could see something shift in her posture. Not anger exactly, but a kind of sad resignation that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had made her feel unwelcome in a place where she had every right to be. She walked back to the seating area behind her lane and started unlacing those beaten-up rental shoes, moving with the same careful precision she'd shown throughout the evening. No dramatics, no angry declarations, just quiet dignity in the face of public humiliation that would have sent most people into a rage. That's when I noticed something I hadn't seen before. As Commander Hayes bent down to unlace her shoes, her pullover rode up slightly in the back, revealing just a glimpse of a tattoo on her lower back. It wasn't much, just a small section of what looked like military insignia, but it was enough to catch the attention of a man sitting 2 lanes over. The man, who looked to be in his 30s with the kind of build that suggested he spent serious time in the gym, suddenly straightened up in his seat. He whispered something to the woman next to him, who turned to look at Commander Hayes with a new expression on her face. Then both of them were staring, not with the idle curiosity of strangers, but with the focused attention of people who were recognizing something important. Commander Hayes finished unlacing her shoes and was reaching for her street shoes when the man from Lane 10 stood up. He moved with purpose, the kind of deliberate motion that makes people stop what they're doing and pay attention. When he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the lanes. "Excuse me, Tyler, is it?" The man's tone was conversational, but there was an undercurrent of steel that made Tyler turn around nervously. "Yeah, that's right. Is there a problem?" "You could say that." The man stepped closer, and I could see now that he had the bearing of someone accustomed to command, even in civilian clothes. "You just told a Marine Corps commander to find another bowling alley because her rental shoes weren't good enough for your family night." Tyler's face went from confident to confused in about 2 seconds flat. "What are you talking about?" The woman from lane 10 had stood up too, and she was walking over with the kind of purposeful stride that suggested she was used to backing up her partner. "That's Commander Lisa Hayes," she said clearly enough for half the bowling alley to hear. "She led a logistics battalion in Afghanistan and Iraq. Those vintage shoes you're making fun of? They're good enough for someone who spent 15 years making sure Marines had what they needed to come home alive." The bowling alley didn't go completely quiet, but there was a definite shift in the atmosphere. Conversations at nearby lanes trailed off as people turned to see what was happening. Kids stopped mid-throw to look at the adults who were suddenly standing and talking in serious voices. Tyler looked around frantically, clearly realizing he'd stepped into something bigger than he understood. "Look, I didn't know, okay? I was just trying to maintain standards here." "Standards?" The first man's voice got a little harder. "Let me tell you about standards. Commander Hayes maintained the standard that kept my unit supplied and operational through 2 deployments. She maintained the standard that meant we had ammunition when we needed it, medical supplies when we got hit, and fuel when we had to move fast. What standard are you maintaining here exactly?" By now, Commander Hayes had stopped putting on her street shoes and was watching the confrontation with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something that might have been gratitude. She clearly hadn't expected anyone to recognize her, let alone stand up for her. Tyler was stammering now, trying to backpedal without losing face in front of what was becoming a growing audience. "Look, I didn't know, okay? I was just trying to maintain standards here." "Standards?" The first man's voice got a little harder. "Let me tell you about standards. Commander Hayes maintained the standard that kept my unit supplied and operational through 2 deployments. She maintained the standard that meant we had ammunition when we needed it, medical supplies when we got hit, and fuel when we had to move fast. What standard are you maintaining here exactly?" By now, Commander Hayes had stopped putting on her street shoes and was watching the confrontation with an expression that mixed embarrassment with something that might have been gratitude. She clearly hadn't expected anyone to recognize her, let alone stand up for her. Tyler was stammering now, trying to backpedal without losing face in front of what was becoming a growing audience. "I mean, I was just doing my job. We have image standards to maintain for family night." That's when the manager appeared. Rita Kowalski had been running Pinewood Lanes for over 20 years, and she had the kind of presence that came from dealing with every possible bowling alley crisis you could imagine. She took one look at the scene, noted the way her employee was standing defensively in front of a customer who was clearly upset, and immediately shifted into damage control mode.
"What's going on here?" Rita asked, but her tone suggested she already had a pretty good idea. The woman from lane 10 spoke first. "Your employee here just told Commander Hayes that her rental shoes weren't appropriate for family night and suggested she might be more comfortable bowling somewhere else." Rita's expression didn't change, but I could see the muscles in her jaw tighten. She looked at Tyler, then at Commander Hayes, then back at Tyler. "Is that accurate?" Tyler opened his mouth to explain, probably to justify his actions with some explanation about maintaining standards and customer experience, but Rita held up a hand to stop him. "Commander Hayes," Rita said, turning to address the woman directly, "I am deeply sorry for any discomfort our employee has caused you. Would you please allow me to make this right?" Commander Hayes, who had been preparing to leave quietly, looked surprised at being addressed so formally and respectfully. "That's really not necessary. I was just going to finish up and head home." "No, ma'am, you were not." Rita's voice carried the authority of someone who'd been in charge of things for a long time. "Tyler, go clock out. We'll discuss this tomorrow." Tyler looked like he wanted to argue, but one look at Rita's face convinced him that discretion was the better part of valor. He slunk off toward the employee area, leaving behind an awkward silence that Rita immediately filled. "Commander, I'd like you to know that Pinewood Lanes has always prided itself on serving all members of our community with respect and dignity. What happened here tonight falls far short of that standard." The man from lane 10 nodded approvingly. "Commander Hayes deserves better than what she got here tonight." Rita turned to him with curiosity. "And you are?" "Staff Sergeant Mike Rodriguez, Marine Corps, retired. This is my wife, Angela. We both served under Commander Hayes in different capacities during our time overseas." Angela stepped forward, adding, "Commander Hayes was known throughout the Corps for taking care of her people. She made sure we had what we needed, when we needed it, no matter what it took. She saved lives by being that good at her job." Rita absorbed this information, then turned back to Commander Hayes with an expression that had shifted from professional courtesy to genuine respect. "Commander, I had no idea we had such distinguished military leadership bowling in our establishment. If you'll allow me, I'd like to make some adjustments to ensure you're properly welcomed here." Commander Hayes looked uncomfortable with the attention. "Really, that's not necessary. I just wanted to bowl a few frames. I don't need any special treatment." "With respect, ma'am, this isn't about special treatment. This is about basic respect that should have been shown from the beginning." Rita paused, clearly making a decision. Tyler was wrong, his attitude was wrong, and his treatment of you was completely unacceptable. That's not how we do business here. Rita walked over to the lane assignment board behind the counter and made a quick change. When she came back, she was carrying a small brass nameplate that she attached to the scoring table at lane 12. "From now on, Tuesday nights, lane 12 is reserved for Commander Hayes. No charge for rental shoes, no charge for games, and anyone who has a problem with that can discuss it with me personally." The small crowd that had gathered around the incident broke into spontaneous applause. Kids who didn't understand exactly what was happening clapped because the adults were clapping. Parents who'd been following the conversation nodded approval. The teenagers working the snack bar had stopped what they were doing to watch, and even they seemed impressed by Rita's handling of the situation. Commander Hayes looked at the nameplate, then at Rita, then at the people who were still clapping. For the first time all evening, she seemed genuinely moved. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Mike Rodriguez said. "Just bowl your game. Show these folks how it's done." What happened next turned into one of those spontaneous community moments that you read about but rarely get to witness. Commander Hayes, still wearing those beat-up rental shoes that had started the whole incident, returned to lane 12 and proceeded to bowl the most perfect game I've ever seen in person. Strike after strike after strike, with a small crowd of families gathering to watch. Kids who'd been struggling to hit any pins at all were mesmerized by her technique. Parents found themselves explaining to their children about military service and respect, and how sometimes the most impressive people are the ones who don't make a big show of themselves. Angela Rodriguez had positioned herself near the scoring table and was providing quiet commentary about Commander Hayes's military service, carefully keeping the details general enough to be appropriate for the family crowd, but specific enough to give people an understanding of why this woman deserved their respect. Commander Hayes ran supply operations in some of the most dangerous areas of Afghanistan, Angela explained to a family whose kids had stopped their own game to watch.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
She made sure Marines had food, water, ammunition, medical supplies, everything they needed to do their jobs and come home safely. She put herself in harm's way regularly to make sure other people had what they needed. Mike had struck up a conversation with some of the other veterans who'd been bowling that night and discovered that Pinewood Lanes was apparently a popular spot for retired military folks. Something about the casual atmosphere and affordable prices made it a natural gathering place for people who wanted to socialize without breaking the bank. By the time Commander Hayes finished her game, she had an unofficial cheering section of about 20 people, including several families who'd abandoned their own lanes to watch her bowl. When she threw her final strike, the applause was genuine and sustained. Rita approached her as she was sitting down to change back into her street shoes. "Commander, I hope you'll consider making Tuesday nights a regular thing. It would be an honor to have you here." Commander Hayes looked around at the faces of the people who'd been watching her bowl, at the families who'd been so enthusiastic about her game, at Mike and Angela who'd stood up for her when she couldn't stand up for herself. "I think I'd like that," she said simply. As the evening wound down and families started heading home, I found myself reflecting on what I'd witnessed. A young employee's casual cruelty had almost driven away a woman who'd spent her career serving others. But the intervention of people who knew her worth, combined with a manager who understood that respect isn't negotiable, had transformed what could have been a humiliating experience into something approaching a celebration. Tyler never came back for his shift the next day. Word around the alley was that he'd decided bowling wasn't really his calling after all. Rita hired a replacement within a week, someone whose first question during the interview was about how to properly serve all customers with dignity and respect. The brass nameplate stayed on lane 12, and true to her word, Commander Hayes became a Tuesday night regular. She usually bowled alone, but there was almost always someone there to chat with between frames, to share a story, or just to nod respectfully when she threw another perfect strike in those beat-up rental shoes that started it all. The weeks that followed turned Pinewood Lanes into something I'd never expected to see. What started as a simple family bowling alley began transforming into an unofficial gathering place for veterans from all over the county. Word had spread quietly through the networks that military families maintain long after the uniforms are put away, and Tuesday nights became something special. I found myself returning week after week, partly out of curiosity and partly because my nephew had become fascinated with Commander Hayes' bowling technique. He'd started practicing the approach she used, trying to copy the way she held the ball, the way she stepped up to the line. His scores hadn't improved much, but his focus had transformed completely. Instead of just hurling the ball toward the pins and hoping for the best, he was thinking about each throw, considering angles and timing in ways that surprised his parents. Commander Hayes had noticed his efforts and had started offering gentle suggestions between her own frames. Nothing formal, just quiet observations about stance and follow-through that somehow sank in better than all the loud encouragement his father had been providing. There was something about her calm authority that made even 8-year-olds want to listen and improve. But it wasn't just my nephew who was drawn to her presence. I started noticing other changes in the Tuesday night crowd. Families who'd been coming to Pinewood Lanes for years were lingering longer, engaging in conversations with strangers that went beyond the usual pleasantries about strikes and spares. Kids were asking their parents questions about military service that led to discussions about history and sacrifice that probably wouldn't have happened anywhere else. The most remarkable change was in the atmosphere itself. Where Tuesday nights had always been cheerfully chaotic, with kids running between lanes and parents juggling scorecards and snack orders, there was now an underlying current of respect and awareness that elevated everything. People were more courteous to the staff, more patient with their children's learning curves, more appreciative of the simple pleasure of spending time together as families. Rita had mentioned to me during one of my visits that their Tuesday night revenue had actually increased since Commander Hayes became a regular, despite the fact that she bowled for free. Families were staying longer, ordering more food, and most importantly, they were coming back week after week instead of treating bowling as an occasional activity. The sense of community that had developed around Lane 12 was drawing people in ways that no marketing campaign could have achieved. The veteran presence had become more pronounced as well. What started with Mike and Angela Rodriguez had grown into a loose network of retired military personnel who'd started showing up on Tuesday nights. Not all of them knew Commander Hayes personally, but word had spread about the respect she commanded and the kind of leadership she represented. Some came hoping to meet her, others came because they'd heard Pinewood Lanes had become a place where military service was understood and appreciated. I watched these interactions with growing fascination. There was an unspoken protocol among the veterans that I gradually began to understand. They didn't interrupt Commander Hayes' bowling or monopolize her time with war stories. Instead, they created a respectful presence around the lanes, available for conversation if she initiated it, but never presumptuous about demanding her attention. The conversations I overheard were illuminating in ways that made me realize how little most civilians understand about military service.
These weren't discussions about combat heroics or dramatic rescue missions. Instead, they focused on the daily realities of leadership under pressure. the challenges of keeping people motivated and supplied in impossible conditions, the weight of making decisions that affected other people's lives and safety. Commander Hayes would listen more than she spoke during these exchanges, asking thoughtful questions about the challenges these younger veterans were facing in civilian life. She had a gift for helping people think through problems without telling them what to do, a leadership style that seemed to encourage independence while providing steady support. One evening in particular stands out in my memory. A young woman named Patricia, recently discharged from the Army after serving as a medic in Syria, had been coming to Tuesday nights for several weeks. She was clearly struggling with something, often sitting alone at the snack bar nursing a single Coke for hours while watching the activity around the lanes with the kind of hypervigilance that suggested ongoing anxiety. I'd noticed Commander Hayes observing Patricia with the same careful attention she gave everything else, but she'd never approached directly. Instead, she'd made subtle efforts to include the younger woman in group conversations, asking her opinion about bowling techniques or commenting positively when Patricia occasionally joined in games with other families. On this particular evening, something was clearly wrong. Patricia had arrived early and had been sitting in the same spot for over an hour, staring at her phone with an expression that mixed anger and despair. When Commander Hayes finished her first game and walked over to the snack bar for her usual coffee refill, she took the seat next to Patricia without invitation. "Rough day?" Commander Hayes asked quietly, not looking directly at Patricia, but maintaining a presence that invited conversation without demanding it. Patricia looked up from her phone, and I could see tears she was trying to hold back. "My old unit's getting deployed again, third time in 4 years. And I'm sitting here in a bowling alley instead of being there with them." Commander Hayes nodded thoughtfully. "Survivor guilt is a real thing, especially for medics. You spent your deployment keeping people alive, and now you're not there to do that job anymore." "Everyone keeps telling me I did my time, that I earned the right to move on with my life. But it doesn't feel like that. It feels like I'm abandoning them when they need me most." The conversation that followed was quiet and intense, two women talking through the complex emotions that come with military service in ways that most civilians never have to consider. Commander Hayes didn't offer easy answers or patriotic platitudes. Instead, she helped Patricia work through the practical and emotional realities of transitioning from a life where your primary purpose was protecting others to a civilian existence where that sense of mission could feel lost. What impressed me most was how Commander Hayes managed to validate Patricia's feelings without encouraging her guilt. She acknowledged the difficulty of the transition while helping the younger woman understand that her service had value beyond her current ability to contribute directly to military missions. The conversation lasted nearly an hour, and by the end, Patricia's posture had changed from defeated to thoughtful. That interaction illustrated something I'd been observing for weeks but hadn't fully understood. Commander Hayes wasn't just bowling at Pinewood Lanes on Tuesday nights. She was providing informal leadership and mentorship to a community of veterans who needed someone who understood their experiences and could help them navigate the challenges of civilian life. Rita had noticed this dynamic as well and had started making subtle accommodations to support it. The seating area around Lane 12 had been expanded with additional chairs and small tables that encouraged conversation. The snack bar menu had been updated to include coffee service that stayed fresh later into the evening. Most importantly, the staff had been trained to recognize and respect the informal counseling sessions that sometimes developed around the veteran community. The impact extended beyond the veterans themselves. I started noticing that civilian families were observing these interactions with growing respect and understanding. Kids who might have otherwise seen military service as something abstract from history books were witnessing real conversations about leadership, sacrifice, and community service. Parents found themselves having deeper discussions with their children about civic responsibility and the cost of freedom. One family in particular, the Hendersons, had become regular fixtures on Tuesday nights specifically because their teenage son David had been struggling with direction and purpose. His parents had noticed how he gravitated toward the conversations around Lane 12, listening intently as veterans discussed challenges and solutions in ways that seemed to resonate with his own uncertainties about the future.
Commander Hayes had eventually noticed David's interest and had started including him in some of the group conversations, not about military service specifically, but about leadership principles and decision-making that apply to civilian life as well. She had a gift for helping young people think through problems systematically, considering consequences and alternatives in ways that built confidence and critical thinking skills. The transformation in David over the course of several months was remarkable. He went from being a sullen teenager who complained about everything to someone who asked thoughtful questions and engaged respectfully with adults. His parents credited the Tuesday night conversations with giving him a sense of purpose and direction that no amount of parental guidance had been able to achieve. These kinds of positive changes were happening throughout the Tuesday night community, but they weren't happening by accident. Commander Hayes had created an environment where respect, thoughtfulness, and genuine care for others were the standard expectations. People rose to meet those expectations because they wanted to be worthy of the community they were becoming part of. The bowling itself had almost become secondary to the social dynamics that were developing. Families still came to bowl, veterans still enjoyed the competition and camaraderie, but the real value was in the connections being formed and the informal mentorship that was happening naturally around the lanes. I found myself thinking about leadership in ways I'd never considered before. In my professional life, I'd encountered plenty of people with titles and authority who tried to command respect through position or volume. But Commander Hayes demonstrated a completely different approach to influence. She led by example, created space for others to succeed, and somehow managed to bring out the best in people without making demands or giving orders. The contrast with Tyler's approach to authority couldn't have been more stark. Tyler had tried to establish dominance through humiliation and exclusion, using his position to make others feel small and unwelcome. Commander Hayes used her natural authority to make people feel valued and capable, creating an environment where everyone could contribute and belong. This difference in leadership style became even more apparent when Rita asked Commander Hayes to help train new employees on customer service. She'd noticed that staff members who worked Tuesday nights seemed to develop better interpersonal skills and more positive attitudes toward their jobs, and she wanted to understand how to replicate that improvement across all shifts. Commander Hayes initially declined the request, saying she was just a customer who wanted to bowl in peace. But Rita persisted, explaining the positive culture developing on Tuesday nights was transforming the entire business, and she wanted to learn how to extend that transformation to other days of the week.
Eventually, Commander Hayes agreed to participate in informal conversations with new employees, not as official training sessions, but as opportunities for them to observe and learn from the community dynamics that had developed around Lane 12. The results were immediate and impressive. New staff members who spent time observing Tuesday nights learned to approach customer service as community building rather than transaction processing. The difference was visible in how they interacted with families, how they handled minor problems, and how they contributed to the overall atmosphere of the bowling alley. Instead of just doing their jobs, they started taking pride in being part of something that mattered to people. Instead of seeing customers as sources of revenue or potential problems, they began seeing them as community members who deserved respect and attention. This shift in employee culture had ripple effects throughout the business. Customer complaints decreased dramatically. Positive online reviews increased. Most importantly, families started choosing Pinewood Lanes over other entertainment options because they felt welcomed and valued there in ways they didn't experience elsewhere. The success of the Tuesday night community had attracted attention from other veterans organizations in the area. Representatives from the VFW and American Legion had started attending occasionally, not to recruit members, but to observe and learn from the informal support network that had developed organically around Commander Hayes' presence. What they found was something that formal veterans organizations had been trying to create for decades: a natural gathering place where military families could connect with their civilian communities in ways that built understanding and mutual respect. The bowling alley setting removed the formal barriers that sometimes made traditional veterans organizations feel exclusive or intimidating to newcomers. Family members who had never served could participate fully in the community without feeling like outsiders. Kids could play and learn while absorbing lessons about service and leadership through observation rather than lecture.
Civilian families could interact with veterans in relaxed settings that encouraged natural conversation rather than formal presentations about military service. The model was so successful that Rita had been contacted by bowling alley operators from other communities who wanted to understand how to replicate the Tuesday night atmosphere in their own businesses. She'd explained that it wasn't something that could be manufactured or imposed from above. It had developed organically around a person's character and leadership, naturally attracted respect and brought out the best in others. But that didn't mean other communities couldn't create similar environments. The key was identifying people who embodied the values of service, respect, and community engagement, and then creating spaces where those values could flourish. It wasn't about military service specifically, though that provided a powerful foundation. It was about recognizing and supporting the kind of leadership that builds communities rather than dividing them. As winter turned to spring, the Tuesday night community faced its first real test. Commander Hayes had been dealing with some health issues that forced her to miss several weeks of bowling. Nothing life-threatening, but serious enough to require medical attention and recovery time that kept her away from Pinewood Lanes. The question was whether the community that had developed around her presence could sustain itself without her direct involvement. Would people continue to come to Tuesday nights if she wasn't there? Would the culture of respect and mutual support survive without her quiet leadership to maintain it? The answer was both heartening and revealing. Not only did the Tuesday night crowd continue to gather, but they organized themselves to maintain the standards and atmosphere that Commander Hayes had established. Mike Rodriguez took on an informal coordination role, ensuring that new families felt welcomed and that conversations remained respectful and inclusive. Patricia, the former medic who had struggled with survivor guilt, found herself naturally stepping into a mentorship role with other veterans who were dealing with transition challenges. The civilian families who had become part of the community took responsibility for maintaining the family-friendly atmosphere that made Tuesday nights appealing to people of all ages. Kids continued to practice the bowling techniques Commander Hayes had taught them, and parents continued the deeper conversations about values and community service that had become part of the Tuesday night experience. Most tellingly, when Commander Hayes finally returned to Pinewood Lanes after the recovery, she found that the community had not just survived, but had grown stronger in her absence. People had learned to take ownership of the culture they valued, rather than depending on her to maintain it for them. They had internalized the leadership principles she had demonstrated and were applying them independently. The sight of her walking back into the bowling alley that first Tuesday night after her illness was emotional for everyone who had been part of the community. But the emotion wasn't just relief at her return. It was pride in what they had accomplished together and gratitude for the foundation she had provided that enabled them to build something lasting. Commander Hayes took her place at Lane 12, laced up those same beaten-up rental shoes that had started everything, and proceeded to bowl as if nothing had changed. But everything had changed. What had begun as one woman's quiet dignity in the face of disrespect had evolved into a community of people who understood that respect, service, and mutual support weren't just military values. They were human values that could transform any group of people who chose to embrace them. As I watched her bowl that night, surrounded by people whose lives had been touched and improved by her example, I realized I was witnessing something rare and precious. In a world that often seems divided by politics, economics, and social differences, a simple bowling alley had become a place where people connected across those divides through shared values and genuine respect for one another. The lesson wasn't complicated or revolutionary. It was as simple as treating others with dignity, leading by example rather than authority, and creating spaces where people could be their best selves. But the impact was profound, reaching far beyond Tuesday nights at Pinewood Lanes to influence how families thought about service, how businesses approached community engagement, and how individuals understood their own capacity to make a positive difference in other people's lives. The real test came 18 months later when Pinewood Lanes faced the possibility of closing permanently. The building's owner had decided to sell the property to a developer who planned to tear down the aging bowling alley and replace it with a strip mall anchored by a big-box electronics store. Rita had been given 90 days' notice, and despite her efforts to find alternative financing or convince the owner to reconsider, it seemed inevitable that the community hub that had developed around Lane 12 would soon be nothing but a memory. The news hit the Tuesday night community like a physical blow. For so many people, Pinewood Lanes had become more than just a place to bowl. It was where veterans found understanding and support, where families connected across generational lines, where kids learned about leadership and respect, where lonely people discovered they belonged somewhere. The thought of losing all that felt devastating in ways that surprised everyone with its intensity. Commander Hayes received the news with her characteristic calm, but I could see the sadness in her eyes as she looked around at the lanes that had become such an important part of so many lives. She'd never sought to become the center of a community, but she understood better than anyone what was at stake if that community was forced to scatter. The first response from the Tuesday night regulars was exactly what you'd expect from a group that included so many veterans. They wanted to fight. Mike Rodriguez immediately started researching legal options for challenging the sale. Patricia began investigating whether there were historic preservation arguments that could delay the demolition. David Henderson, now a confident young man heading off to college in the fall, started an online petition that quickly gathered thousands of signatures from people who supported keeping the bowling alley open.
But Commander Hayes approached the crisis differently. Instead of fighting the decision directly, she focused on what could be preserved and continued regardless of what happened to the building. She started having quiet conversations with community members about the values and connections they developed, emphasizing that those things didn't depend on a specific location to survive and flourish. Her approach initially frustrated some of the more action-oriented veterans who wanted to mobilize for a direct campaign to save Pinewood Lanes. But as always, her patient leadership style eventually helped people see the deeper issues at stake. The question wasn't just whether they could keep the bowling alley open, but whether they could maintain the community they'd built regardless of where they gathered. Rita found herself caught between her desire to keep the business alive and her practical understanding that fighting the property sale was probably hopeless. She'd run the numbers countless times, looking for ways to match the developer's offer or find alternative financing, but the mathematics were unforgiving. Even if she could somehow raise enough money to buy the building, the ongoing costs of maintaining an aging facility while competing with newer entertainment options made long-term sustainability questionable. That's when Commander Hayes made a suggestion that surprised everyone. Instead of trying to save Pinewood Lanes as it was, why not use the crisis as an opportunity to create something better? The community they'd built had outgrown the physical space anyway. Tuesday nights were often crowded to the point where some families had to wait for lanes. The informal mentorship and support programs that had developed needed more structured space and resources to serve everyone who wanted to participate. What if they could find a way to create a true community center that incorporated bowling but also provided meeting space, educational programs, and support services specifically designed around the values and connections that had developed organically over the past year and a half? The idea seemed impossibly ambitious at first. Community centers required significant funding, ongoing operational support, and coordination with local government and nonprofit organizations. But Commander Hayes had spent her military career making impossible logistics work in challenging circumstances, and she approached this challenge with the same systematic thinking that had kept Marines supplied and safe in war zones. She started by reaching out to contacts in the veteran service organizations that had been observing and learning from the Tuesday night community. Many of these organizations had resources and expertise, but lacked the natural gathering places where their programs could reach the people who needed them most. The possibility of partnering to create a facility that combined recreation with community services appealed to leaders who had been struggling to engage younger veterans and military families. Local government officials were also intrigued by the proposal. The city had been looking for ways to better serve the veteran population, but traditional approaches had met with limited success. The organic community that had developed at Pinewood Lanes demonstrated that veterans were willing to engage when they felt welcomed and respected rather than treated as problems to be solved or beneficiaries to be managed. Corporate sponsors began expressing interest as well, particularly companies that employed significant numbers of veterans and were looking for authentic ways to support military families in their communities.
The success of the Tuesday night community had attracted positive media attention, and businesses wanted to be associated with a program that was clearly making a measurable difference in people's lives. As the 90-day deadline approached, Rita found herself coordinating meetings between potential partners who had never worked together before but were united by their respect for what Commander Hayes had accomplished and their desire to preserve and expand it. Military service organizations, local government agencies, business leaders, and community groups were all contributing ideas and resources toward creating something unprecedented. The breakthrough came when a local philanthropist who had been quietly observing the Tuesday night community for months stepped forward with an offer to purchase a larger facility that could house bowling lanes and community service programs. She'd been impressed by the multi-generational connections and the practical support systems that had developed organically, and she wanted to ensure that those elements could continue and grow. The new facility would include 12 bowling lanes, meeting rooms for support groups and educational programs, a cafe that could host informal gatherings, and office space for veteran service organizations to provide counseling and assistance programs. Most importantly, it would maintain the inclusive, family-friendly atmosphere that had made the Tuesday night community so successful. Commander Hayes was offered the position of Community Director, responsible for maintaining the culture and values that had made the original community work while overseeing the expansion of programs and services. She initially declined, saying she'd never intended to become a professional community organizer. But when the board of directors made it clear that the position would be structured around her leadership style rather than requiring her to change her approach, she agreed to consider it. The transition from Pinewood Lanes to the new Veterans and Family Community Center took place over several months, during which the Tuesday night community continued to meet in temporary locations around the city. The group was larger now, including families who had heard about the program and wanted to be part of the new facility. But the core values and informal leadership structure that Commander Hayes had established remained intact. When the new center finally opened, the first event was a special Tuesday night bowling celebration that brought together everyone who had been part of the journey from that first confrontation over rental shoes to the creation of a permanent community resource. Rita had been hired as the facility manager, bringing her years of experience and her deep understanding of what made the community work. Many of the staff members from Pinewood Lanes had found positions at the new center, ensuring continuity of the customer service culture that had developed. Lane 12 in the new facility was marked with an updated brass nameplate that read Commander Hayes Community Lane, but the tradition of keeping it available for anyone who needed a place to belong continued. The beaten-up rental shoes that had started everything were retired to a display case in the main lobby, along with a plaque explaining how small acts of disrespect could be transformed into opportunities for building community and mutual support. The programs that developed in the new facility expanded far beyond what anyone had originally envisioned. The mentorship relationships that had formed naturally on Tuesday nights became structured programs that paired experienced veterans with those transitioning to civilian life. The family support networks that had developed around the lanes became formal programs offering childcare, educational assistance, and financial counseling. The leadership development that had happened informally through Commander Hayes' example became workshops and seminars that attracted participants from throughout the region. Business leaders, educators, and community organizers came to learn about the leadership principles that had created such a successful and sustainable community organization. But the heart of the operation remained the same. Tuesday nights were still reserved for open bowling and informal community gathering, where families could connect with veterans, where kids could learn about service and leadership through observation and conversation, where lonely people could discover they belonged somewhere important. Commander Hayes maintained her role as the quiet center of the community, still bowling and rental shoes, still offering gentle guidance to anyone who sought it, still demonstrating through her daily actions what leadership looked like when it was focused on serving others rather than advancing personal interests. The impact of the community center reached far beyond its own programs and participants. Other communities began requesting assistance in developing similar facilities, leading to a network of veteran and family community centers that shared resources and best practices. The model was particularly successful because it wasn't based on replicating specific programs or structures, but on understanding and implementing the leadership principles that made authentic community possible. Military families who moved frequently found that they could connect with local veteran communities through these centers, easing the transition challenges that made military life so difficult for spouses and children. Civilian families discovered opportunities to support military communities in meaningful ways that went beyond symbolic gestures or holiday parades. The success attracted attention from policymakers and researchers who were studying effective approaches to veteran transition and community integration. But Commander Hayes consistently declined invitations to speak at conferences or participate in formal studies, preferring to focus on the daily work of maintaining and nurturing the community that had grown around her quiet leadership. The measuring stick for success wasn't publicity or recognition, but the steady stream of families who found support when they needed it, veterans who discovered purpose and community in civilian life, and young people who learned about leadership and service through example rather than lecture. Patricia, the former medic who had struggled with survivor guilt, eventually became the assistant director of the center, specializing in transition support for recently discharged veterans. Her own journey from isolation to leadership illustrated the transformative power of community support and demonstrated how personal healing could become the foundation for helping others. David Henderson returned from his first year of college with stories about how the leadership lessons he'd learned during Tuesday nights had helped him navigate the challenges of university life and organize community service programs on campus. He'd found ways to apply the principles of inclusive leadership and mutual respect that he'd observed in the bowling alley to completely different environments and challenges. Mike and Angela Rodriguez became volunteer coordinators for the family support programs, using their experience with the Tuesday night community to help other families understand how to balance military pride with civilian integration. Their own marriage had been strengthened by their involvement in the community, and they wanted to help other military couples navigate the unique challenges of veteran family life.
Rita's business experience proved invaluable in managing the operational aspects of the larger facility, but she credited her time at Pinewood Lanes with teaching her how to create environments where people felt valued and respected. The customer service approach she'd learned during the Tuesday night transformation became a model for training programs throughout the hospitality industry. The ripple effects extended in directions that no one had anticipated. Local schools began incorporating character education programs based on the leadership principles demonstrated at the community center. Business organizations started requesting workshops on authentic leadership and community building. Churches and civic groups adapted the inclusive, service-oriented approach to their own community outreach efforts. But perhaps the most significant impact was on the veterans and families who continued to gather every Tuesday night for bowling and conversation. For them, the success wasn't measured in expansion or recognition, but in the simple fact that they had a place where they belonged, where their service was understood and appreciated, where their families could connect with others who shared their experiences and values. Commander Hayes often said that the best leadership was invisible, creating conditions where other people could succeed without drawing attention to the leader's role in making it possible. The community center that bore her name represented exactly that kind of leadership impact, a lasting institution that would continue serving families long after she was no longer there to guide it directly. On quiet Tuesday evenings, when the bowling lanes were full of families and the meeting rooms hosted support groups and the cafe buzzed with conversation between veterans and civilians, you could see the fulfillment of everything that had started with a young employee's disrespectful treatment of a woman whose worth he couldn't recognize. The transformation wasn't just in the facility or the programs or the number of people served. It was in the understanding that community wasn't something that happened automatically, but something that required intentional effort, consistent values, and leadership that focused on bringing out the best in others rather than demanding recognition for itself. The bronze plaque in the lobby, next to the display case with those old rental shoes, included a simple inscription that captured the essence of what had been accomplished.
Respect is earned through service, community is built through inclusion, and leadership is measured by the success of those who follow. Commander Hayes still bowled every Tuesday night, still wore rental shoes by choice even though she could afford her own, still approached each frame with the same careful attention that characterized everything she did. But now she bowled surrounded by a community that had learned to perpetuate the values she demonstrated, ensuring that the respect, support, and belonging she'd fostered would continue touching lives for generations to come. The story that had begun with humiliation and disrespect had become a legacy of dignity, service, and community that proved how individual character could transform not just personal relationships, but entire organizations and the broader communities they served. It was a reminder that leadership didn't require rank or title or recognition, just the commitment to treat others with dignity and create spaces where everyone could contribute their best. Years later, when people asked Commander Hayes about the secret to building such a successful community organization, she would simply point to the rental shoes in the display case and remind them that respect starts with how you treat people when you think nobody important is watching, and community begins when you decide that everyone is important enough to be treated with dignity and kindness. The final chapter of this story happened 3 years after the community center opened, when Commander Hayes decided it was time to step back from her formal leadership role. At 75, she felt the younger generation of veterans and community leaders were ready to carry the mission forward without her daily guidance. The decision wasn't driven by health concerns or external pressure, but by her belief that truly effective leadership eventually makes itself unnecessary. The farewell celebration was planned as a simple Tuesday night bowling event, but it grew into something much larger as word spread through the extended community that had developed around Commander Hayes' quiet leadership. Veterans drove in from neighboring states, families who had moved away returned for the evening, and community leaders who had learned from the center's model came to pay their respects. What struck me most about that evening was how Commander Hayes deflected every attempt to make her the center of attention. When speakers tried to highlight her role in transforming a simple bowling alley dispute into a thriving community resource, she redirected the focus to the contributions of others. When families shared stories about how the center had helped them through difficult transitions, she emphasized the strength they'd shown in helping each other. The presentation of gifts and proclamations from various organizations was handled with her characteristic grace, but the moment that seemed to move her most was when Patricia announced the establishment of the Hayes Leadership Development Fund, designed to support emerging leaders in veteran and civilian communities who demonstrated the same service-oriented approach that had made the center successful. The fund wasn't just about money, though several major donors had contributed significantly. It was about identifying and nurturing people who understood that leadership meant creating opportunities for others to succeed, that respect was earned through consistent character rather than demanded through position, and that the strongest communities were built on inclusion rather than exclusion. Commander Hayes' successor as community director was David Henderson, now graduated from college with a degree in social work and a clear sense of purpose that traced directly back to those Tuesday night conversations during his teenage years. His appointment represented the full circle of mentorship and development that had been at the heart of the center's success from the beginning. The transition was seamless because Commander Hayes had spent years developing distributed leadership throughout the organization. No single person held all the institutional knowledge or carried sole responsibility for maintaining the culture that made the center work. Instead, dozens of volunteers, staff members, and community partners understood their roles in perpetuating the values and practices that had proven so effective. The Tuesday night tradition continued unchanged, with Commander Hayes returning to her original role as a participant rather than a leader. She still occupied Lane 12 when it was available, still offered gentle guidance to anyone who sought it, still demonstrated through her weekly presence that retirement from formal leadership didn't mean retirement from community involvement. The rental shoes display had been expanded to include artifacts from families throughout the community, creating a visual history of the transformation that had begun with one woman's dignity in the face of disrespect. Children who visited the center learned the story as part of their understanding of how communities grow and change, how individual choices can have far-reaching consequences, and how respect and inclusion create stronger foundations than exclusion and discrimination. The model developed at the center had influenced policy discussions at state and federal levels about effective approaches to veteran integration and community building. But Commander Hayes had consistently declined invitations to testify before legislative committees or participate in policy development, maintaining her focus on the daily work of community building rather than the political dimensions of veteran issues. Her approach to this final transition reflected the same principles that had guided her throughout the entire journey. Rather than clinging to authority or seeking ongoing recognition for past contributions, she trusted the community to continue growing and evolving based on the foundation she'd helped establish. The true measure of her leadership would be whether the values and practices could survive and thrive without her direct involvement. The evening concluded with a final game of bowling that included 4 generations of families who had been touched by the center's programs. Commander Hayes bowled her characteristic steady game, still wearing rental shoes by choice, still approaching each frame with the careful attention that had become her trademark. When she rolled her final strike of the evening, the applause was sustained and heartfelt, but it felt more like a beginning than an ending. As families began gathering their belongings and saying their goodbyes, I found myself reflecting on everything I'd witnessed over the past 4 years. What had started as a simple story about workplace rudeness and disrespect had evolved into something much more significant, a demonstration of how individual character and quiet leadership could create lasting change in unexpected ways. The lesson wasn't complicated, but it was profound. Respect wasn't about demanding recognition or asserting authority. It was about treating others with dignity regardless of their ability to benefit you. Community wasn't about finding people who were exactly like you. It was about creating spaces where differences could be appreciated and everyone could contribute their unique strengths. Most importantly, leadership wasn't about having the right title or commanding attention. It was about consistently demonstrating the values you wanted to see in the world, creating opportunities for others to succeed, and building institutions that could continue making a positive difference long after your own direct involvement ended. Commander Hayes had never sought to become a community leader or social innovator. She'd simply wanted to bowl a few frames in peace without being made to feel unwelcome. But her response to disrespect, her consistent character under pressure, and her ability to inspire the best in others had created something that would continue touching lives for decades to come. The bronze nameplate was still attached to Lane 12, but it no longer reserved the space for one person. Instead, it had become a symbol of the values that everyone in the community was expected to uphold, a reminder that respect is earned through service, community is built through inclusion, and leadership is measured by the success of those who follow. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.